Okay, we're going to continue recording. And here we're talking about the steps of nutrient processing. Okay, so we went over the 6 steps of nutrient processing: ingestion, which is basically eating or drinking; digestion, breaking down large molecules into small ones by hydrolysis. Basically, you're taking the polymers, turning them into monomers. Absorption is when you take those monomeric units and you transfer them from your gut into the blood, into the circulatory system. And then the circulatory system does the distribution of those nutrients and takes those nutrients to your cells. Then when your cells uptake those nutrients, mostly by facilitated diffusion or by endocytosis, those little nutrients get used up by the cell, either for the cellular respiration, meaning using the nutrients to make ATPs, or used for assimilation, meaning using those nutrients as building blocks to make more of yourself. And finally, waste elimination would be the last step of nutrient processing, where you take the metabolic waste products and excrete them out of your system. Okay. So now we're going to talk about cellular respiration, and that's what we're going to be focusing on for most of the part today. What is respiration? So once again, when we say a respiration, it doesn't necessarily mean breathing. When we talk about cellular respiration specifically, we simply mean taking the energy of food and turning it into the energy of ATP. So recharging your batteries inside your cells using the energy of food. That food gets into your cells with the help of your digestive system and with the help of the circulatory system that brings those nutrients to all your cells. Okay, so let's talk about respiration in detail now. First of all, we need to know that when we use nutrients to make ATPs, we use the nutrients as fuel, and glucose is actually the preferred fuel for your cells. So if you give your choice, if you give your cells the choice, do you want to burn glucose for energy, or do you want to burn fat for energy, or do you want to burn protein for energy? Your cells will always choose to burn glucose first. And you're going to see reasons for that. Basically, glucose is a very versatile and very clean fuel. It doesn't leave too much metabolic waste that you would have to work hard to excrete out. And you can burn it for energy and use it to make ATPs with or without oxygen. Okay, so let's start from the beginning. Let's start talking about how do we use glucose for fuel. Okay, now you probably have been using terms, okay, burning calories, burning carbs, burning fat. What does that really mean when we say burning? Well, the burning actually comes from the fact that most of the chemical reactions that would mean burning or combustion reactions, these are the reactions of nutrients or pretty much anything with oxygen. So when you make wood react with oxygen, the wood burns. When you make glucose react with oxygen, the glucose burns. When you make oil react with oxygen, the oxygen burns. Okay, so combustion reaction or burning reaction simply means a reaction of something with oxygen. Okay, now, of course, without oxygen, you can't burn anything. All right, so if you want to burn glucose for fuel, you have to make it react with oxygen. So how do you do that? Well, this is why you need to eat to bring glucose into your cells, and you need to breathe to bring oxygen into your cells. When you look at each cell individually, inside the cells, the oxygen meets the glucose and they react with each other. They burn, the glucose burns in the presence of oxygen. Okay, not literally with flames and smoke and fire, but it reacts with oxygen, and when it reacts with oxygen, a lot of energy gets released, and that energy gets used to recharge your ATP batteries. Okay, you can do the same thing with fat. You can bring the fat into the cell, you bring the oxygen into the cell, and basically in the cell, if this is a cell, okay, you have to bring glucose into the cell. Okay, so you eat the glucose or you eat the fat. Fat will do too. Okay, you eat the glucose or fat. You breathe in the oxygen. Breathe. Oops. Okay, you breathe the oxygen, and the oxygen comes into the cell. Inside the cell, the glucose will react with oxygen and produce a lot of energy. They burn. Glucose burns in the presence of oxygen in the cell, and energy gets released. Energy. And when the energy is released, that energy can be used to recharge your ATP batteries. Okay, so that's the most important thing you need to understand today. You need to eat and you need to breathe, because when you eat, you bring the fuel into the cells, but you cannot burn the fuel without the oxygen. That's why you need to breathe also. All right, I'm going to erase this, and we're going to move on to the next part. Okay, so if we were to summarize what we're going to be talking about today, when we're going to talk mostly about burning glucose for energy today. So when you burn glucose, you basically take the glucose and make it react with oxygen. And when you burn something completely, you see a CO2 gas and water getting produced. And that is true for burning pretty much anything. You could put wood here or cellulose with oxygen, it will still yield CO2 and water. You could put fat and make it react with the oxygen, it will still yield CO2 and water. If it burns completely, it will burn all the way to CO2 and H2O. Okay. As a result, a lot of energy gets released, and that energy is used to take the ADPs, which is your discharge battery, reattach the phosphate groups to that, and produce a bunch of ATPs. Okay. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to talk about the process in a little bit more detail. Okay, so we're going to go on to part 2, cellular respiration. So cellular respiration, let's talk about cellular respiration. Okay, we mentioned cellular respiration is the process of taking the nutrients and turning the energy trapped in those nutrients into the energy of ATP molecules. So the whole process is basically can be broken up into 3 major chemical reaction cascades, 3 major processes. And those processes are, first, glycolysis, second, the Krebs cycle, and the third, electron transport chain. Okay? So what we're going to do is we're going to go through these processes one by one. We are not going to go into too much great detail for these processes. We are just going to cover the very, very basics of what you need to know. This is not a biochemistry course. This is not a molecular biology course or cell biology course. You really don't need to memorize every single reaction, but you do need to know the overall reactions. Okay, so you need to know what those processes are. You need to know what's glycolysis, you need to know what's Krebs cycle, you need to know what's electron transport chain, and you need to know the major players there. You need to know what you get at the beginning of each one of those processes and what you get at the end of each one of those processes. Okay, so let's take a look. Let's start with the first one, glycolysis. Okay, what's glycolysis? If you take the word glycolysis and you break it down into its parts, it literally means glyco means glucose and lyse means break. So it literally means the break of glucose. You take a glucose molecule and you split it in half. Now, this is not a single reaction. It actually takes 10 chemical reactions to do that. And that means that it takes 10 different enzymes to do that. What you need to know is that you start with a glucose molecule and you end up with taking that glucose molecule and breaking it in half. So if you take a look at a glucose molecule looks like this right here. And if you count how many carbons you have in a glucose molecule, 6 carbons. So what we're interested in is take that glucose molecule, which is like a ring, and kind of open the ring, and you will see these 6 carbons. We're just going to follow the carbons. Just follow the carbons with me. That's all I'm asking you to do. You take the carbons, the 6 carbons the glucose molecule is, it takes 10 chemical reactions, which, by the way, are completely reversible. So if you wanted to, you could completely go back and make glucose out of the products of the glycolysis. So glycolysis is 10 chemical reactions, after which you take the 6 carbons and you split them in half. So you take the 6 carbons and you split up into 3 and 3. 3 carbon molecule and 3 carbon molecule. These carbon molecules are called pyruvate. So this is what you need to know, bottom line. Glycolysis is the first step in cellular respiration. It means that you take a 6 carbon glucose molecule and break it in half to yield 2 pyruvate molecule. As a result, also in the process, by doing that, by splitting the carbons, remember when you split a chemical bond, you release a lot of energy, and you release enough energy to make 2 ATPs in the process of glycolysis. Okay. Process of glycolysis is completely reversible, which means that if you really are running out of glucose, you can take 2 pyruvate molecules, and I'm going to talk about where you're going to get those pyruvate molecules later on. But you can take 2 pyruvate molecules and turn them back into glucose molecules. Okay, so that's all you need to know about glycolysis. You take a 6 carbon glucose molecule, split it up into 2 pyruvate molecules. Okay, now the next step would be Krebs cycle step. But we cannot get into Krebs cycle until we go through this intermediate step. The intermediate step is basically just one single reaction before we get into Krebs cycle. And in that intermediate step, we take the pyruvate molecule, we add oxygen to it, we cut off a carbon from each pyruvate molecule and make it hook up with the O2. And now this carbon and this O2 make a CO2 that separates. And the rest of the pyruvate, we have only 2 carbons left of that molecule. That becomes what we call an acetyl group. Now you can also see that this reaction is very important, and it's also one-way reaction. So several things you need to keep in mind about this. First of all, you cannot go from pyruvate into the Krebs cycle until you go through this step. Second, this step requires oxygen, and this is where you yield the first CO2. Number 3, very important, this reaction is a one-way reaction, which means that once you made the acetyl groups out of pyruvate molecules, you cannot take the acetyl groups and turn them back into pyruvate molecules. This is a one-way reaction. Okay, one more time. You can take pyruvate and turn it into acetyl groups, but you cannot take acetyl groups and turn back into pyruvate because this is a one-way reaction. Okay. Now these acetyl groups will get attached to a special coenzyme. It's like a carrier. It's called coenzyme A, or CoA to be short. And the acetyl group attached to a coenzyme A is usually referred to as the acetyl-CoA. But we're just going to call it acetyl groups just to keep things simple. If you've taken biology classes before, the acetyl-CoA will sound familiar to you. If you haven't, no big deal. All I need you to know is this. Glucose molecule is a 6-carbon molecule that gets split by glycolysis in half, and you get 2 3-carbon molecules called pyruvate. Then the pyruvate undergo a one-way reaction to become acetyl groups. So one glucose molecule yields 2 pyruvates, which then become 2 acetyl groups. Once you got the acetyl groups, then those acetyl groups will enter the next step, and that is the Krebs cycle. So now we're going to talk about these are the second and third processes, and the most important that you need to know about them is that they both will require oxygen. They both require oxygen, and they would yield the most ATPs that you're going to get out of burning that one glucose molecule. So each one of these legs of this glucose breakdown, we go from the beginning. Remember, glucose molecules are 6-carbon molecules. Each 6-carbon molecule of glucose will yield 2 3-carbon molecules, which are pyruvates at the end of glycolysis, and that process would release 2 ATPs. The irreversible intermediate step requires oxygen and will yield a CO2 on each side, and you get 2 acetyl groups here. Now, each acetyl group is going to go through the Krebs cycle, and those require also oxygen, and those would release an ATP on each side. And after the Krebs cycle, the products of the Krebs cycle and actually glycolysis as well will go on into the electron transport chain. And the electron transport chain on each side will yield 17 ATPs on each side. Okay, so if we go back and count everything, we started with a glucose molecule, right? We invested 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 oxygen molecules. Okay, we have produced 2 ATPs, 3, 4, that's 4, plus 17, that's 38 ATPs have been produced through this whole entire process. Okay. Now, what you need to know also is this. The glycolysis, when you produce only 2 ATPs, is the only process that does not require oxygen. And also, this process happens in the cytoplasm of the cell. So it's not happening inside any organelle other than just the liquid that's inside the cell. The rest of it, from pyruvate and on, the rest of it is happening in the mitochondria. You need oxygen to move on from pyruvate all the way through Krebs cycle and electron transport chain. You need oxygen, and that happens in the mitochondria, and that's where you produce most of your ATPs. Okay, so bottom line, Up until pyruvate, you don't need to be in the mitochondria and you don't need oxygen, but you only make 2 ATPs. From pyruvate and for the rest of the processes, you do need oxygen and you need to be inside a mitochondria if you want to make the rest of the 38 ATPs. Okay. So I would like you to go through the practice questions and watch this video. And then the video is going to talk about NADH, FADH. You don't need to worry about those things. I'm going to tell you right now, just know the numbers, know how many ATPs are produced where, and at what point you need oxygen, and what happens in the cytoplasm and what happens in the mitochondria. In the meantime, we're going to go on to the next part here. And we're going to talk about anaerobic respiration versus aerobic that we just covered. So the process that we just went over, okay, this process where you take a glucose molecule and you use it out completely with oxygen and you make 38 ATPs just by burning one glucose molecule. This is called aerobic respiration of glucose because you are using oxygen. It's like with air. You are using glucose with air and you produce 38 ATPs because you can go through all these processes. If for some reason your cells are running low on oxygen and the oxygen is not getting to the cells quickly enough, you cannot go through all these steps. You can only go as far as pyruvate. So you only go as far as glycolysis. You take a 6-carbon glucose molecule, split it in half into pyruvate molecules, and that's it. That's as far as you can go. You produce only 2 ATPs. That happens in the cytoplasm. That happens without oxygen. So that would be anaerobic respiration. The only problem with that is that you cannot leave it as pyruvate molecules for the reasons that we're not going to discuss in this class. But what you need to know is that if you cannot go from pyruvate to the acetyl group through Krebs cycle electrotransport chain, then you take the pyruvate molecule and you're going to turn pyruvate molecules into lactic acid molecules. That's called lactic acid fermentation. So you're going to take a 6-carbon glucose molecule without oxygen. If you don't have oxygen in your cells or you're running low on oxygen, you're going to start taking the glucose, split it through glycolysis to make 2 pyruvate molecules. And then you take those 2 pyruvate molecules and turn them into 2 lactic acid molecules. That's called lactic acid fermentation. Lactic acid fermentation. Have you ever had like a really strenuous workout that, a kind of workout that you didn't do before, or you worked a different group muscle this time that you didn't work before very much? Well, the next day you're probably going to feel sore. Your muscles are going to feel sore. And the reason why they feel sore is that when you were having that workout, when you were loading your cells with extra work, you put a demand on those cells to produce ATPs to move those muscles. And at the same time, your muscles were not used to that kind of load. So your muscles weren't used to taking as much oxygen to burn the fuel as quickly. So as a result, your muscle cells that didn't get enough oxygen quickly enough, that were not used to this kind of workout, they took the glucose, turned the glucose into pyruvate without the oxygen. And then because they ran out of oxygen, they turned that into lactic acid. Now, the following day after your workout, you start moving the lactic acid out of your muscles so that you can take the lactic acid to your liver to turn the lactic acid back into glucose so you could use it up, because lactic acid is an acid. Now, because it's an acid, it's going to hurt. And that's why when you're mobilizing the lactic acid from your tissues the following day after your strenuous workout, your tissues, your muscles are going to hurt and they're going to get sore, okay, until all that lactic acid is removed and turned back into glucose. So that lactic acid is going to go to your liver, like we said, and within the next 24 to 48 hours, your liver is going to turn that lactic acid back into glucose by the process called gluconeogenesis. Gluconeogenesis literally means glucose that's new getting produced. Genesis. Okay, so genesis means production of new glucose, production of new glucose. Okay, so once again, if you are running low on oxygen, instead of taking the glucose and turning it all the way to CO2 and water in the presence of oxygen, if you're running low on oxygen, you're going to take the glucose and you're going to turn it into pyruvate through glycolysis and then turn pyruvate into lactic acid. And we call that lactic acid fermentation. Okay, so when we look at this little video here, you have it like a short animation of this. So if we look at the lactic acid fermentation, see what happens is when your muscles work in the absence of oxygen, they're going to produce lactic acid. Lactate is the same thing as lactic acid. Then lactic acid the next day is going to get taken to the liver, and the liver turns it back into pyruvate, back into glucose by gluconeogenesis, and then return it back that glucose back into your system so you can use it again. Okay, that's why we call it a futile cycle. Futile cycle, it's basically taking glucose, turning it into lactic acid, and turning lactic acid back into glucose. What you're doing is you're producing ATPs, but then you're going to have to use up those ATPs. So you're actually burning, in the long run, you're burning more calories by doing the lactic acid fermentation than you would if you were just using glucose aerobically. Okay. Okay, so here we are. So this is what we call the futile cycle, because to your body, to your cells, it's futile. It doesn't make sense because you are using, you're producing 2 ATPs in a short run, but then you're going to have to use up those ATPs again. So in the long run, you didn't produce any ATPs. You just used up the fuel. Okay. Now, some other organisms, instead of lactic acid in the absence of oxygen, they produce alcohol. Okay, like yeast that would take glucose and ferment it into alcohol to make beer and wine and leavened bread, things like that. So there are different kinds of fermentation, and we're going to talk about that more when we get to the microbiology part of this course. But for now, I want you to watch all these little videos about aerobic fermentation and aerobic respiration and anaerobic respiration, which is fermentation. Okay. And in the meantime, we're going to go over this summary real quick here. Okay. So bottom line, we need to eat and we need to breathe in order for our cells to get the fuel that they need. All right. So on this side over here, you can see the part where we talk about the nutrient processing. And over here on this side, we're talking about the respiration, bringing the oxygen in and CO2 out. Okay, so we need to eat things like carbs and fats. In this case, we're going to talk about eating carbs. So when you eat carbs, like the starches will get digested into individual glucose molecules. And those glucose molecules will get absorbed into the blood. The blood will distribute the glucose molecules to your cells and tissues. Your cells will uptake glucose by facilitated diffusion with the help of insulin, who will open the doors for the glucose to come in. And then at the same time, when you inhale air, you bring oxygen into your lungs. From your lungs, the oxygen moves into your blood by simple diffusion. And then the blood carries it to your cells, who take up oxygen also by simple diffusion. Inside the cells, your glucose meets the oxygen, and the glucose gets burned aerobically to produce 38 ATPs. And when it burns completely, it yields CO2 and water. The CO2 is a metabolic waste, so it needs to be taken out. So CO2 diffuses out of the cell into the blood, and blood carries it back to the lungs, where the CO2 enters the lungs again by simple diffusion, and then you exhale that CO2 out of your system. Okay, that's pretty simple explanation of this complex process. But here you can see step by step why is it that you need to eat and you need to breathe. Okay. So, as promised, we're going to talk about the digestive system. So, we talked about nutrient processing before. We talked about the 6 steps of nutrient processing. Okay, and the digestive system is responsible for almost all the steps except for the distribution and assimilation and cellular metabolism. The digestive system is participating in the 4 out of 6 steps of nutrient processing. So what you need to know about the digestive system is that we can break up the whole digestive system into 2 major parts. One is the tube, as I call it, the tube or alimental canal, that's another word for it, or also known as gastrointestinal tract. It's just a continuous tube that starts in your mouth and it goes on down and becomes stomach. Here it's wider, and then it becomes this convoluted tube, and then it becomes this larger tube, and then it ends in the anal opening. Okay, it's one continuous tube. That's what you need to know. So that's what we call the alimental canal or the GI tract. Now, in addition to the alimental canal, you have several organs that are not part of the tube, but they help the digestion because they produce secretions that you need to digest the nutrients. Okay, we call those accessory digestive organs. And you need to know 4 very important accessory digestive organs. One of them would be the salivary glands in the mouth. Then there is the liver that produces bile, the gallbladder that stores that bile, and then there's the pancreas, which produces most of your digestive enzymes. Okay, 4 accessory digestive organs. All right, so you need to know all the parts of the alimental canal and the accessory digestive organs. All right, your digestion actually starts at the point of ingestion. Remember, ingestion means when you eat something or drink something, it gets into your mouth, and in your mouth or buccal cavity, that's where you start the digestion. So you start masticating, meaning chewing the food and mixing it with saliva. And then that's where the salivary glands contribute their secretions, because salivary glands produce certain enzymes, certain enzymes that start the digestion of starches actually, and produce some antibacterial enzymes and fluids, and actually some anti-acid chemicals. All right, so once we bypass the mouth and the food gets swallowed, the tongue pushes the food back toward your throat and you swallow. From that point on, whatever you swallowed is called a bolus. It's basically whatever you swallow, the mouthful of food or fluid, that's a bolus. So that bolus is going to go down your throat, and it's going to go through your pharynx, And remember, epiglottis is going to close the entrance into the larynx so that the food or that bolus does not go into your respiratory ways. Instead, the bolus has to go down the esophagus. Okay. Now, from the point when the food reaches the back of your throat, from there on, the food is moved down your digestive tract, not by gravity, but by a special set of these smooth muscle contractions called peristalsis. Okay? Peristalsis is a special type of contractions of your digestive tract that moves and propels the bolus forward. So if you can imagine, if you take let's say, a stocking, okay, or a pantyhose, and you put a potato in there. Potato is not going to move anywhere unless you squeeze the pantyhose, and the potato will move forward down the pantyhose. So the peristalsis contractions are kind of like squeezing the pantyhose to move that potato down, move that bolus forward and forward and forward. So bolus will never go back unless you throw up, and the bolus then the bolus would go back up. But other than that, the bolus should never go back up. Okay. So from the back of your throat, the peristalsis will start pushing your bolus down your esophagus. Okay. Esophagus is the tube that connects your throat to your stomach, and whatever enters the stomach should actually stay in the stomach thanks to the special set of the circular muscle called esophageal sphincter. The esophageal sphincter, its second name is cardiac sphincter, but esophageal sphincter, it kind of squeezes the bottom of the esophagus closed so that the bolus doesn't back up from stomach into the esophagus. Otherwise, the stomach acid would burn the esophagus. When the esophageal sphincter doesn't work very well, that's exactly what happens. The stomach acid goes back up into the esophagus and burns the esophagus. And you get this burning sensation, and we call it a heartburn. But what it is, it's a dysfunctional esophageal sphincter that doesn't hold the stomach acid in the stomach. Okay? So from the esophagus, we get into the stomach. Things you need to know about the stomach is this. The stomach is a container organ. It's a muscular container organ. And the stomach is there to store your lunch. Whatever you ate, it's going to store it, because stomach does not really do most of the digestion. Most of the digestion is done by your small intestine, specifically the first part of the small intestine, or the duodenum. So the stomach is going to store your bolus, produce the gastric juice, which is the hydrochloric acid, very strong acid. Then there is the mucus that protects the stomach lining. Then there is this enzyme called pepsin, which starts the digestion of proteins. And very importantly, the intrinsic factor. The intrinsic factor is a special molecule that binds vitamin B12 from your food. So when you eat vitamin B12 that's in your food, and that's going to be mostly in the animal products, the intrinsic factor produced by your stomach, it's like a special carrier that will bind the B12 and carry it all the way to the later small intestine, okay, more down the stream. And in the later small intestine, that's where the intrinsic factor will allow vitamin B12 to get absorbed, okay, later in the small intestine. But without the intrinsic factor produced in the stomach, you cannot absorb vitamin B12. And if you don't have intrinsic factor, for whatever reason, and you can't absorb vitamin B12 because of that, you get something called pernicious anemia. We're going to talk about pernicious anemia in I think chapter 17, I believe, when we talk about anemia. But for now, just know that stomach produces intrinsic factor, which is necessary to absorb vitamin B12. Okay? So when the stomach takes all these parts of the gastric juice, the acid, the mucus, the pepsin, and B12, all that together, it mixes up with the food that you ate and produces this chyme. So this liquid I don't know, soup. That's basically the food you ate with all the digestive juices of the stomach. That's called chyme. If you throw up and you see this liquid stuff, that's chyme. Okay, so the stomach doesn't do most of the digestion and absorption. The stomach mostly stores your bolus and mixes it with the gastric juice and produces chyme, and then it releases that chyme into your small intestine drop by drop, allowing your small intestine to do most of the digestive work. So most of the digestion happens in the small intestine. So if you look at the stomach, I'm going to go back to the picture of the stomach. So if this is the stomach, it has a sphincter at the top, the esophageal sphincter, that prevents the food from backing up into the esophagus. And then there is the sphincter at the bottom of the stomach that also is kept tight. That is called the pyloric sphincter. And the pyloric sphincter is the one that would allow the chyme to go from the stomach into the duodenum drop by drop, little by little, giving the duodenum the time to digest the food that you ate. And this is where most action happens, in the duodenum. Okay, so what you need to know is the small intestine is where most digestion and absorption happens. This is where you digest your carbs, proteins, and fats. And in jejunum and ileum, the second and third part of the small intestine, that's where you absorb most of the vitamins and minerals. So the small intestine is composed of three parts: the duodenum, jejunum, and ileum. The duodenum is where you digest and absorb most of your carbs, proteins, and fats with the help of the pancreas. The pancreas is going to secrete these important enzymes into the duodenum. Basically, it's going to inject these enzymes to allow you to break down fat, break down starches, break down proteins, so that you can absorb them right there. Okay, so pancreas produces those things. At the same time, liver produces bile to help you disperse the fats in the chyme. Okay, remember how we talked about surfactants? Well, bile salts and bile acids, they are surfactants, and they allow the fat droplets to stay dispersed in the chyme so that you can actually digest and absorb the fat as well. Okay. Now we mentioned the second and third part, the jejunum and the ileum. That's where your vitamins and minerals get absorbed, including vitamin B12 that gets carried by that intrinsic factor produced in the stomach, remember? Okay. Now I want you to take a look at this picture, because this picture is really good at showing you the inner surface of the intestinal wall. And you can see that the inner surface has these wrinkles, lots and lots of wrinkles, the big wrinkles and the tiny wrinkles. So the big wrinkles are called the villi, and the little wrinkles are called microvilli. And what they do is they increase the surface area of the small intestine so that you have more contact between the chyme and basically your body to be able to absorb all those important nutrients into your system. Okay. Now, from the small intestine, or the chyme is going to enter the large intestine, or we call it the colon. And the first part of the colon is called cecum. Okay, let me see if this picture shows the cecum. Yes, it does. So the small intestine, okay, over here, it enters the colon. Colon is this part right here. Okay, so the first part over here, the first bulging part of the colon is the cecum, and over here you're going to see the tiny little protrusion from the cecum. That's the appendix, or the dead end. The appendix doesn't have much of a digestive function in humans. It does in horses, but not in humans. In humans, it's more of a lymphatic organ because it acts mostly as a lymphatic tissue, and we're going to talk about lymphatic system and appendix as lymphatic tissue later on in this class. But for now, just know that the colon starts with cecum, with the little appendix here, and you start with ascending colon going up, transverse colon going across, and then descending colon going down. And then you see this S shape like that, S. That's a sigmoid colon. And then the last part going straight down, that's the rectum and the anus. What you need to know about the colon is this. Colon is where you absorb most of your water and electrolytes. Water and electrolytes are absorbed in the colon. Also in the colon, in the later part of the colon, that's where you have good bacteria that help you digest things that you couldn't digest, like fiber. Okay, so once again, okay, you need to know what's cecum, what's appendix, ascending, transverse, descending colon. You need to know that there is the good bacteria living in there, and the good bacteria help you digest food that you didn't digest. And they also produce, very importantly, they produce two important vitamins. There are vitamin K and biotin, very important two vitamins. So without the normal flora, we might become deficient in vitamin K. And that's why newborn babies whose colon has no bacteria in them at all, their colon is sterile, they need a shot of vitamin K. Vitamin K is needed for normal blood clot factor production, so clotting factors production. That's why vitamin K is called K, because K in German stands for clotting. If you spell clotting with K, which is a German way of spelling it. Okay, so vitamin K is needed for you to produce clotting factors, and you get vitamin K mostly from the bacteria that live in your colon. Okay. Then when you get a chance, please watch the digestive system video here. And this is where we are going to wrap this up. Okay. I strongly recommend that you go to this link over here and work on this worksheet. You can actually print it out, Word document for you. And it's a nice little worksheet that you can color and label on your own. Okay. All right. When you get a chance, that was not it. But when you can open this and take a look, you can play with it and practice labeling structures of the digestive tract and the accessory digestive organs. And don't forget today's math. And make sure to do your practice questions before you attempt today's quiz and post-lecture discussion. Have fun. Bye.